Hi all, and welcome to today's virtual event. Thank you for joining us for Startup Dissolutions, Guidance for Founders in Challenging Times. We know that this topic has been something that's been top of mind for many in the startup community, especially in the past year. And that's why we wanted to put together today's panel so that they could share insights from various perspectives on how to best manage and navigate this incredibly complex process of winding down a business. Joining us today, we have Henry Ward, founder and CEO at Carta, Ben Bayat, managing director at NextGen Venture Partners, a early stage and growth stage VC fund, Mike LaPlante, a partner at Morrison Foerster, who has served as a strategic advisor and lawyer to hundreds of startups and founders, and myself, I'm Connie, and I help Carta build products to make founders' lives easier across their entrepreneurial journey, including when that journey concludes. Whether you're contemplating dissolving your startup right now, or you're in the middle of actually winding it down, you're certainly not alone. Peter Walker, our head of insights at Carta, recently shared a few data points that helps contextualize the current state of the ecosystem. For example, the time between raising a Series A and Series B on average used to be anywhere from 18 to 24 months, but now we're seeing that stretch out to 2.5 years. At the same time, we've seen a 70% increase in startups that are shutting down from 2022 to 2023. Henry, Mike, Ben, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on these trends and maybe some of your insights into the outlook for 2024.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, Connie. Ben, Mike, thanks for and everybody in the audience. Thanks for being here. Love to talk about this. Just so everybody knows, I've been through this once. So Carta was my second company. My first one was called Second Sight. It was a robo-advisor, kind of like Betterment or Wealthfront. But Andy and Josh did a way better job than I did, and I had to fold my version of it. And so I went through that whole process, and it's just tough. It's like there's no like book on it. There's nobody that really helps you on it. You're sort of doing it alone. Nobody wants to deal with it because you don't want to deal with it. Your investors don't want to deal with it. By definition, you do it when you're sort of telling everybody to, you've laid off all the employees, you've sent everybody home, and it's just you now. It's just you kind of figuring this out. And I always thought that I'd want to build a product to help founders with this because I had been through it, and it was always percolating in the back of my mind doing it. And for a bunch of reasons, we just never, got around to doing it. It took a while for us to get the internal inertia to do it. But now, as you can tell, it's like becoming more of a thing, and we're starting to see founders, realize, hey, maybe this idea wasn't the right idea. Many of them, as I did, had another idea that they were like, this is the idea I want to go pursue, but I still have to deal with, figuring this last thing out. And in some ways, the inability the dealing with the old thing makes it harder to go start the new thing. And the more we can do to help founders clean up the old thing and make it easier to get started with the new thing, the more startups we can create in the world, the more successful startups we can create in the world. And obviously, we're indexed highly to successful startups. If we create a lot of successful startups in the world, Carta does well. If there aren't successful startups, we don't do well. And so it's part of our mission to create successful startups. So that's why I'm super excited to talk about this.
Yeah, maybe just weigh in on the current environment. This is a tough topic, but as Henny described, it is the part of the journey of a startup. And as you referenced in some of the data that Peter and Carta Insights has provided, this is many founders are going through this, so people aren't alone in that part of the journey. But much like fundraising, even more so winding down or coming to the end of a startup, people have even less experience around. And so hopefully what we get into today is what's some of the market trends driving in this direction, and what are best practices that you can bring to the company, the employees, customers, shareholders, all the key stakeholders.
Yeah, definitely. We want this to be a little bit of a more, open conversation and give founders a little bit of insight into conversations that they don't necessarily spend the entire time preparing for as they launch into, venture or a new business that they're founding. Henry, maybe we'll start with you, and would love to hear a little bit more about your journey at Second Sight. What were some of the things that made you decide that maybe, Second Sight was not the company that would be successful for you? What were some of the things that you thought through as you decided to dissolve that company and run along?
Yeah. So I remember one of my investors that I was working with on it, we were trying to raise our first price round, our seed round. And, investors are helping me, we're doing the tour, and we just wasn't connecting. And I think one of the things I tell a lot of founders, and, I hope Ben, after me, you'll opine on this as well, because you see it from the other side. But, a lot of founders, there is, you're a salesperson, you're selling your idea and your company and yourself as the person that do this idea. And sometimes, you just don't have product market fit for what the current investor climate is. And at the time when this was 2012, 13, fintech was not a thing at all. Fintech was payments at the time. That was fintech. It was PayPal and PayPal derivative companies. And so when you're coming in and you're like, hey, we're gonna do robo investing, automated investing, like people are just like, what? Like nobody's invested in anything similar to that. And I give, Josh's and Andy's, Betterment and Wealthfront's, investors so much credit for betting on them and that early vision. But I just couldn't get that kind of investor to bet on something that was really sort of unprecedented at the time. And people just weren't interested. They liked me, they liked the idea, all those things, but they weren't willing to bet on it. And I remember talking to one of my investors, and he said, you should think about doing something else, because and he'll use these words I'll never forget. He says, the market has spoken. The market doesn't want this idea. And I said, and I didn't believe him, because as founders we're too proud, and we're like, yeah, they're stupid, I'll figure this out. And so I went at it for another 3 to 6 months, and then eventually realized I was hitting my head against the wall, that this wasn't going to happen. And I went back and I said, you were right. Do you have any other ideas for me? And that ended up becoming eShares. So it worked out for me. But that was the thing, is like, I think a lot of founders are, there is, value in persistence, and, like keep going even when it gets rough. But there's a lot of value too in like, hey, the market's spoken, this is not going to work.
Yeah, I might add to that in sharing. So before I was in venture, I was an engineer, a data scientist, had my own founder journey. But from an investor lens, I often use the phrase that startups are a design of experiments, and what you're really trying to solve for is the versions of a business that can appeal to the most important stakeholders. And in the earliest stage of a startup, but true throughout the lifetime, because there's different profile of investors, but you really have to appeal to both customers and investors. And so some of what Henry was describing was customers may buy in, but investors don't yet believe that there's a category there. So category creation is a risk. At the same time, you might have sufficient interest from investors, but the revenue model is not yet producing, and so you don't have sufficient traction to be able to show the story to investors. And so some of those challenges, when founders are thinking about, well, where do I take the business? You have to think about that design of experiments, in that there is always the option of this is not working. But that persistence, in that, what 95% of what most conversations are focused on is, well, just beat your head against these different walls, and one of these is going to break through. And so we can have infinite number of conversations about that type of a strategy, but ultimately, the founders that understand the totality of the option set also include that winding this down, and that the wind down could be after having gone through all of the different versions of what's possible. Or I've seen other investors that have shared scenarios with me where the thing that the company, that the entire ethos of the domain expertise, the product, everything was focused on something that just became a free feature within iOS. And so that's a tough scenario. And so at that time, people might look around the table, have a board discussion and say, like, is the right thing to do, return investor capital, and we move on. So the range of scenarios where, closing that chapter becomes an option is pretty wide.
It's such a great point, Ben. I remember, in the old days, this was like 2016, I think, or something. We were all in the office, of course, and we'd have like TVs and stuff. And they did the Worldwide Developer Conference. I think it was 2016 for Apple, and they came, and that was the year like they announced the Apple Watch. They announced like a music thing. They announced like all this stuff. It was like one of the most amazing products, announcements in years of Apple. And I can't remember them all, but they were like, at the time, all the early stage founders, we also used to hang out together. And I used to hang out with the Pebble founders, and many people don't remember Pebble, but Pebble was the original Apple Watch. Yep. And they were like taken off, and there was like a bunch of other startups that had been doing things, and then Apple just came in and announced, yep. They're doing music streaming, they're doing this, they're doing that, and I just remember watching this going, oh my God, please, Apple, do not say they're going to do cap tables, because like this, it's over for me. And Apple just wiped out a whole category, not categories of startups. And there's a really tough, so something that was actually a really good idea. The market changes, and the market is changing. The world is changing so fast these days. And I think that also makes it really hard for founders to like figure out. But I'm actually curious, like, how do you have, for your portfolio companies that maybe something has changed, right? The experiments have worked out, maybe an incumbent has come in and the whole value proposition, what your offer has suddenly become, not a product, but a feature, not even a business, but a feature of something else. Like, how do you approach those conversations with your founders?
Yeah. So, as many investors would share, the conversation really starts with, well, okay, what is our runway? And that's both in terms of the capital that is available as well as the energy, because this is hard work, right? So if people don't have it in them to like circle back and try something different, you can't, not everybody can be, the original version of Twitter and, pivot into something that was an internal tool. So you start with kind of like a lay of the land, like, what's the option set look like? And some of those option sets can be a pure pivot. Others can be, all right, well, what is it that we have that is valuable today? That can be customer contracts and revenue that might be, attractive to an acquirer. That might be IP and technology that also might be attractive. And then there's acqui-hires and the team that you have. Can we keep this group together, but maybe focus somewhere else inside of a different organization? And then, of course, there is the, if there's sufficient capital to return, is that a conversation we should have today? What is the runway that we would have if we tried one of these other paths? And you kind of map out the option set. And what we will probably start getting into is communicate with the key stakeholders. And there's a lot of business decision to this. There's also legal liability. And so, I know we have Mike on that can start to touch on some of that aspect of it. But the biggest headline that I always like to describe is try to do right by everyone. And a big part of that is communicating early, avoiding brinksmanship. But you do have to manage that communication, right? Because if you start to communicate too early to early tenured employees, they might just start looking for what's next. So if you have a viable path, you do have to think about, okay, well, how do we want to present this? So positioning, the timing, all of those would come into the business side of the decision matrix. And then you have, the whole legal aspect, which, Mike, you're probably in a better position to speak to.
Thanks, Ben. Sorry, everyone, for some technical difficulties at the beginning here. But I missed a little bit of the beginning, but there's sort of like two zones where two types of wind downs, right? There's the obvious one, which is we're out of money. And then there's sort of we've pulled on all the threads we can pull on and there's nothing left to pull on. So we're going to wind this thing up and we're going to return some capital. You know, when you're in the first bucket, where you're actually running out of money, there are some things to think about well in advance of that point. There are what we call toxic liabilities, things that if you're not able to pay those liabilities, you can be personally held responsible for covering those liabilities. These are things like taxes, payroll. You know, if you're not going to make payroll because you're out of money, this is something you need to plan for well in advance, because those become personal liabilities if the company can't cover them and has to shut down. So that's the first big one, is if you're in that kind of we're running out of money bucket, is to keep in mind what your toxic liabilities are so they don't get passed down to you. And then the second one, if you do have some money left over, you know, a lot of folks that are founders that sit on boards don't realize that you have a fiduciary duty to your stockholders. And what a fiduciary duty means is that you have to act in somebody else's best interests. And so once you reach this point where you sort of have some capital left over, you've tugged on all the threads, nothing's coming undone, and you're sort of like, hey, this one didn't work out, you have to start really thinking about, well, I have a duty to these stockholders to return as much capital to them as possible. And that includes trying to sell whatever assets you have, making sure you preserve the capital that you do have. I get a lot of questions from founders. They're like, yeah, we only have 200 grand left. Can we just keep that for ourselves? Obviously, the answer there is no. And to Ben's point that I heard when I did join, really the best plan for all of these things, like every single aspect of a dissolution, the best plan is to be really transparent with your major stakeholders and have all these conversations, at least with your stakeholders, as early and as often as you can.